They were told American soldiers would execute them on sight. But when Maria Russo collapsed on frozen ground in January 1944, unable to feel her legs after 3 days of marching, the enemy did something she never expected. Instead of leaving her to die, 2 American medics lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her through the snow. What happened next would shatter everything she believed about her captors and about herself. If you enjoy these untold stories from World War II, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true accounts from history. The winter of 1944 bit hard across the Italian countryside. Snow covered the roads like a white blanket, hiding the mud and blood underneath. Along these frozen paths, a group of 37 women walked in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were auxiliary workers, part of the Italian military support system, radio operators, typists, nurses, and assistants who had worked behind the lines. Now, with Italy shattered and broken after switching sides in the war, these women found themselves on the losing end of history. Maria Russo was among them. At 23 years old, she had spent 2 years working as a communications operator in a military office in Naples. She had never fired a gun, never seen combat directly. Her war had been fought with telegraph keys and radio dials, passing messages she barely understood to places she had never seen. Now she wore a thin wool coat over her uniform, boots that were 2 sizes too large and stuffed with newspaper for warmth, and a scarf wrapped around her head that did little to stop the wind. Her fingers were numb inside worn gloves. Her feet had stopped hurting 2 hours ago, which she knew was not a good sign. The group had been walking for 3 days since their surrender. American forces had swept through their region, and rather than fight, their commanding officer had simply ordered them to gather their belongings and wait. When the Americans arrived, they had been lined up, counted, and marched north toward a collection point. No one had told them where they were going. No one had explained what would happen to them. The guards, young American soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave, simply pointed and said, "Walk." So they walked. The cold was the worst part. It crept through every layer of clothing, settling deep in the bones. Maria's teeth chattered constantly. She had stopped trying to control it. Around her, other women stumbled and shuffled, their faces pale and blank with exhaustion. The sound of boots crunching on frozen ground filled the air. Someone coughed, a wet, rattling sound that had been getting worse each day. Another woman whispered prayers under her breath, the words tumbling out in an endless stream. The landscape rolled past like a nightmare that never ended. Burned-out farmhouses stood like black teeth against the white snow. Abandoned vehicles rusted by the roadside. Once they passed a crater where a bomb had torn the earth apart, and Maria glimpsed something dark at the bottom that she forced herself not to think about. The smell of wood smoke drifted from distant villages, reminding her of home, of her mother's kitchen, of everything she had lost. Her stomach cramped with hunger. They had been given bread that morning, hard, stale chunks that hurt to chew, but it was never enough. Maria tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. That was all that mattered now. One step, then another. Don't think about the cold. Don't think about where they were going. Don't think about the stories they had heard, whispered rumors of what Americans did to prisoners. Her friend Lucia walked beside her, or at least she had been. Maria turned to say something and realized Lucia had fallen behind. She could see her 20 feet back, limping badly, her face twisted in pain. "Keep moving," an American soldier called out in broken Italian. "No stopping." Lucia struggled to catch up, and Maria slowed her pace slightly, waiting. When Lucia reached her, she grabbed Maria's arm for support. "I can't feel my feet," Lucia whispered. "Maria, I can't feel them at all." "Don't talk," Maria said, though her own feet had gone numb an hour ago. "Just walk. We must be close now." But they were not close. The march continued into the afternoon. The sun was a pale disk behind gray clouds, giving no warmth. Maria's legs began to feel strange, heavy and distant, as if they belonged to someone else. Each step became harder than the last. She thought about her family. Her mother and younger sister were still in Naples, or at least they had been when she last heard from them 6 months ago. Were they alive? Did they know where she was? Would she ever see them again? These questions circled in her mind like birds with nowhere to land. It happened suddenly, though later Maria would realize the warning signs had been there for hours. They were climbing a gentle slope on the road when her right leg simply stopped working. One moment she was walking, the next moment her leg buckled beneath her. She stumbled, caught herself, tried to take another step. Her left leg gave out. Maria fell hard onto the frozen ground, landing on her side with an impact that knocked the air from her lungs. She lay there gasping, unable to move, unable to understand what had happened. "Get up!" The American guard was walking toward her, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "Get up! We cannot stop!" Maria tried to push herself up with her arms. Her legs would not respond. She looked down at them, expecting to see some horrible injury, but they looked normal. They just would not move. "I can't," she said in Italian. Then, remembering the few English words she knew, she tried again. "I cannot." My legs. No feel. No feel. Lucia dropped to her knees beside Maria, her own face pale with fear. Maria. Maria, what's wrong? I can't feel my legs, Maria said, and suddenly she was terrified. The numbness that had been creeping up from her feet had spread to her thighs, her hips. Everything below her waist felt like it belonged to a stranger. Lucia, I can't feel them at all. The other women in the group had stopped walking and were gathering around. The American guards were shouting, trying to get everyone moving again, but no one listened. They stared at Maria lying on the ground, and in their eyes she saw her own fear reflected back. If she could not walk, what would happen to her? Would they leave her here to freeze? Would they shoot her to save themselves the trouble of dealing with her? These thoughts raced through her mind as she struggled to move, to stand, to do anything. But her legs remained lifeless and heavy. One of the guards, a corporal with a thick neck and red face, pushed through the crowd of women. He looked down at Maria with an expression she could not read. Anger? Annoyance? She braced herself for whatever would come next. But then something unexpected happened. The corporal knelt down beside her. Up close she could see he was young, maybe 25, with blue eyes and freckles across his nose. He said something in English, speaking quickly, then seemed to realize she did not understand. He held up one hand in a gesture that clearly meant, wait. Then he stood and jogged back down the road, shouting for someone named Doc. Two men came running up the road, carrying bags over their shoulders. They wore the same uniforms as the other soldiers, but with red crosses on white armbands. Medics. Maria's heart pounded. She had heard stories about military doctors, about how they treated enemy prisoners. In her mind, she imagined rough hands, painful examinations, indifference to her suffering. The first medic, a thin man with dark hair and gentle eyes, knelt beside her. Hey there, he said softly in English. My name is Thomas. This is my partner, Joe. We're going to help you, okay? She did not understand the words, but his tone was calm and reassuring. He was not angry. He was not rough. He simply opened his bag and began pulling out supplies. Joe, the other medic, was broader and had a friendly face. He smiled at her, actually smiled, and said something that sounded encouraging. Then he began unlacing her boots. Maria panicked. No, no! She tried to pull away, though her body would not cooperate. What were they doing? Why were they removing her boots? Lucia grabbed her hand. It's okay, Maria. Let them help. They are trying to help. The medic named Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder, not restraining her, but steadying her. He looked into her eyes and nodded slowly, as if trying to communicate through will alone that she was safe. Joe removed her boots carefully. Even through her numbness, Maria could see her feet were in bad shape. They were pale, almost blue in color, and swollen. When Joe pressed gently on her foot, she felt nothing. Thomas said something urgent sounding to Joe, who nodded and pulled a blanket from his bag. They wrapped it around her feet and lower legs, moving quickly but carefully. Then Thomas did something that shocked Maria to her core. He took off his own jacket, his warm military-issue jacket, and placed it over her body like an extra blanket. In the freezing January air, he was now wearing only his uniform shirt, and she could see him shiver slightly. Why would he do that? She was the enemy. She was Italian, and Italy had fought alongside Germany for years. Why would an American soldier give up his warmth for her? Joe pulled out a metal stretcher from somewhere and unfolded it beside her. The two medics looked at each other, communicated with head nods and brief words, and then bent down. With surprising gentleness, they lifted Maria onto the stretcher. Thomas supported her head and shoulders while Joe handled her legs, moving carefully to avoid causing pain. Once she was settled, they wrapped her in 2 more blankets until she looked like a cocooned bundle. Maria stared up at the gray sky, unable to process what was happening. These were enemy soldiers. They were supposed to be cruel, violent, uncaring. That was what she had been told, what everyone knew. But Thomas and Joe were neither cruel nor violent. They were just 2 young men trying to help someone in trouble. Thomas and Joe lifted the stretcher, one on each end. Maria felt herself rise into the air, and for a moment panic fluttered in her chest. She was completely helpless now, dependent on these strangers who spoke a language she did not know. The corporal who had called for the medics barked orders. The group of women began walking again, but slower now. Thomas and Joe walked in the middle of the group, carrying Maria between them. She watched the sky pass overhead, gray clouds moving slowly, a bird circling high above. The movement of the stretcher was gentle, steady. Despite everything, despite her fear and the numbness in her legs, she felt something unexpected. She felt safe. Every few minutes Joe would say something to her in English. She did not understand the words, but she understood he was checking on her, making sure she was okay. Once he reached over and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders when it started to slip. Lucia walked beside the stretcher, her hand resting on the edge as if maintaining a connection. "How do you feel?" she asked in Italian. "I still cannot feel my legs," Maria admitted. "But I am warm now." "Lucia, why are they being so kind?" Lucia shook her head, her eyes wet. I do not know. I do not understand any of this. The march continued for another hour. Maria lost track of time, drifting in and out of awareness. The rhythmic movement of the stretcher, the warmth of the blankets, and the exhaustion of 3 days of marching all combined to pull her toward sleep. She thought she heard Thomas humming softly, a tune she did not recognize but found oddly comforting. Finally, as afternoon faded toward evening, they reached a town. It was small, mostly intact, with American military vehicles parked along the main street. Buildings that had been commandeered as temporary headquarters showed signs of recent occupation, sandbags by doorways, radio antennas on roofs. Thomas and Joe carried Maria into a building that smelled of disinfectant and coffee. It was warm inside, blessedly warm, and she nearly wept at the feeling of hot air on her face. They set the stretcher down in a room full of cots. A man in a white coat, a doctor clearly, came over immediately. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke to Thomas and Joe in rapid English, examining Maria while they talked. His hands were gentle but professional as he checked her pulse, looked at her eyes, and carefully unwrapped the blankets from her legs. When he saw her feet, his expression became serious. He said something sharp to Thomas, who nodded and hurried away. The doctor looked down at Maria and said, in heavily accented Italian, "You will be okay. We fix." And incredibly, impossibly, Maria believed him. The next hours passed in a blur of activity that Maria struggled to understand. The doctor, she later learned his name was Captain Morrison, worked quickly and efficiently. Thomas returned with basins of warm water, not hot, but carefully temperature-controlled. The doctor explained something to her in his broken Italian about circulation and cold injury, but she only caught fragments of words. What she understood was this: her legs had shut down from the cold and exhaustion. The blood flow had slowed to almost nothing. If left untreated, she could lose her feet, even her legs. But if they could restore circulation gradually, she might recover completely. They immersed her feet and lower legs in the warm water. The sensation was extraordinary. First nothing, then a tingling like 1,000 needles, then pain so intense she cried out. Joe held her hand through it, squeezing back when she squeezed, his face full of sympathy. I know, the doctor said in Italian. Pain is good. Pain means feeling returns. You must be brave. Maria bit down on a rolled cloth they had given her and endured. Tears streamed down her face. Lucia sat beside her cot, stroking her hair and whispering encouragement. After 20 minutes, they removed her legs from the water and dried them gently. The doctor massaged her feet and calves, working the muscles with firm, practiced movements. Gradually, slowly, sensation began to return. She could feel his hands on her skin. She could feel the pressure of his fingers. When he asked her to try moving her toes, she concentrated with all her might and felt them shift slightly. Good. Captain Morrison smiled for the first time. Very good, you see? Not so bad. Not so bad, Maria thought, was perhaps an overstatement. Her legs felt like they were on fire, and the aching went deep into her bones. But she was starting to feel them again, and that was something. That was everything. They gave her hot soup, real soup with vegetables and even small pieces of meat. She ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. It was the first hot meal she had eaten in 4 days. A nurse came by, a kind woman with red hair and a warm smile, and helped Maria into clean, dry clothes. The hospital gown was thin but clean, and after days in the same uniform, feeling clean fabric against her skin was a small miracle. That night, Maria lay in the cot with 3 blankets piled on top of her. Around her, other patients slept. American soldiers recovering from wounds, a few civilian refugees, and 2 other Italian prisoners like herself. She stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Everything she had been told about the Americans was wrong. They were supposed to be monsters. Instead, they had saved her life. The next morning, Thomas came to check on her. He brought with him a young Italian-American soldier named Private Angelo Benedetti, who served as a translator. The doctor wants to see you try to stand today, Angelo translated. He says your circulation is much better, but you must take it slow. With help from Thomas on one side and Angelo on the other, Maria swung her legs over the side of the cot. Her feet touched the floor, and she felt the cold tiles against her skin. Actually felt them. Ready? Thomas asked through Angelo. Maria nodded. They helped her stand, supporting most of her weight. Her legs trembled like a newborn calf, barely able to hold her. But they held. She was standing. Try 1 step, Angelo encouraged. She lifted her right foot, moved it forward 6 inches, set it down. Then the left. Another 6 inches. She had walked perhaps a foot, but she felt like she had climbed a mountain. Excellent! Thomas gave her a thumbs up, a gesture that needed no translation. Over the next 3 days, Maria slowly regained her strength. They had her walk a little more each day, first across the room, then down the hallway, then outside for fresh air. Her legs ached constantly, but the feeling was returning. She could wiggle all her toes now. She could feel when someone touched her knee. Captain Morrison checked on her every morning and evening. Through Angelo, he explained that she had been very close to serious injury, but she would make a full recovery. "You are lucky," Angelo translated. "If you had walked for another hour, we might not have been able to save your feet. And if you had been left alone in the cold—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. During her recovery, Maria had time to observe the medical facility. It was a former schoolhouse that had been converted into a temporary hospital. About 30 beds filled what had once been classrooms. The Americans had brought in real medical equipment, proper supplies, even electricity from portable generators. What struck her most was how the medical staff treated everyone the same. The American soldiers got the same care as the Italian prisoners. The civilian refugees got the same attention as the military personnel. No one was left untreated, no one was ignored. She watched Thomas and Joe make their rounds, checking on patients, changing bandages, offering words of comfort. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, without complaint. One afternoon, Lucia was allowed to visit. She sat on the edge of Maria's cot, holding her friend's hand. "The others have been moved to a prison camp," Lucia said quietly. "Not far from here. They say it is not terrible. There is food, shelter. We are lucky, Maria. We are very lucky." "What will happen to us?" Maria asked. Lucia shrugged. "I do not know. For now we wait. We live. That is enough." On the fourth day, Maria walked the entire length of the hallway without assistance. Her legs still ached, but they worked. She could feel them. She could trust them to hold her weight. Captain Morrison examined her that evening and declared her fit to be moved to the prison camp with the others. "You must continue to exercise your legs," Angelo translated for him. "Walk every day. Do not let them get cold again. And eat. You must eat to stay strong." Maria nodded, then said something that surprised even herself. "Please tell the doctor thank you. Tell him I thought I would die. He saved my life," Angelo translated. Captain Morrison looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. "You are welcome," Angelo translated his response. "But Thomas and Joe, they are the ones who carried you. They are the ones who saved you. Without them, I could have done nothing." On her last evening at the medical facility, Thomas came to say goodbye. Angelo accompanied him to translate. "I wanted to give you this," Thomas said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Maria unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of thick wool socks, new ones, clean and soft. Below them was a small bar of chocolate. She looked up at Thomas, confused. "I cannot accept—" "Please," Angelo translated for Thomas. "Your boots are too big. These socks will help. And the chocolate— My mother always said chocolate makes everything a little better." Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. She had tried so hard not to cry in front of the Americans, to maintain some dignity. But this simple act of kindness broke through her defenses. "Why?" she asked through her tears. "Why are you so kind to me? I am the enemy. Italy fought against you." Thomas listened to Angelo translate, then thought for a moment before responding. "You are not my enemy." Angelo translated his words. "You are just a young woman who was cold and hurt. My sister is about your age. I would hope that if she were in trouble, someone would help her. Enemy, friend, these are just words. You are a person who needed help. That is all that matters." Maria clutched the socks and chocolate to her chest. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that would express the depth of her gratitude and confusion and wonder, but all that came out was, "Thank you." Thomas smiled and patted her shoulder gently. "Get well. Be safe." Then he left, returning to his other duties. That night, Maria lay awake, wearing her new socks, the chocolate bar tucked carefully under her pillow. She thought about everything that had happened since her collapse on the road. She had expected cruelty and received compassion. She had expected neglect and received dedicated medical care. She had expected to be treated as less than human, and instead had been treated with a dignity she had not felt in years. The propaganda she had heard throughout the war now seemed like hollow lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were just people. People who could have left her to die, but chose instead to carry her to safety. The next morning, a truck arrived to transport Maria and 3 other recovered Italian prisoners to the camp where the rest of their group was being held. Joe helped her into the truck, making sure she was steady on her feet. "Take care," he said in English, giving her a warm smile. Maria smiled back and said one of the few English phrases she had learned. "Thank you very much." Joe laughed, delighted. "Very much, yes, very good." As the truck pulled away from the medical facility, Maria looked back at the building. Thomas and Joe stood in the doorway, waving. She waved back until they disappeared from view. Lucia, sitting beside her in the truck, nudged her gently. "You are different now. I can see it in your face." "Different how?" Maria asked. "I do not know exactly, but something has changed." Maria thought about this. Lucia was right. Something had changed. She had left behind something on that frozen road. Not just the numbness in her legs, but something deeper. The fear had lifted. The certainty that she understood the world had crumbled. In its place was something new and uncomfortable. Doubt about everything she had believed and a strange gratitude toward people she had been taught to hate. The prison camp was located in a valley outside a town whose name Maria never learned. It was surrounded by fences, but not the tall, threatening barriers she had imagined. The buildings were simple wooden structures, barracks for sleeping, a mess hall for meals, administrative offices. When Maria arrived, the other women from her group rushed to greet her. They had heard about her collapse and had feared the worst. "We thought they had left you to die," one woman exclaimed, embracing her tightly. "No," Maria said quietly. "They saved me. The American medics carried me for hours. They treated me in their hospital. They were kind." Some women nodded as if this confirmed what they had already learned. Others looked skeptical, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as a trick. Life in the camp followed a routine. Wake at dawn. Breakfast, usually bread, sometimes porridge, always hot coffee. Work assignments, light labor like laundry, cooking, cleaning, or helping in the camp garden. Lunch, more work, dinner. Free time before lights out. Maria was assigned to the camp kitchen where she helped prepare meals for the 200 Italian prisoners housed there. The work was not hard, and the warmth of the kitchen was pleasant after the cold of the march. What surprised her most was the food. They were given 3 meals a day, every day. The meals were simple: bread, soup, sometimes pasta, occasionally meat, but they were sufficient. No one went hungry. She thought of her family back in Naples, where food had been scarce for years. She thought of her younger sister Rosa, who had written in her last letter about eating nothing but watery vegetable broth for days at a time. Here, as a prisoner of war, Maria ate better than her family at home. The contradiction twisted in her stomach like a knife. The guards at the camp were professional but not cruel. They maintained order without brutality. Maria never saw anyone beaten. She never heard screaming from interrogation rooms. The worst punishment for breaking rules was extra work duty or loss of privileges like the weekly canteen where prisoners could buy small luxuries with the wages they earned. Wages. They were actually paid for their work. Small amounts of camp script that could be used to buy things like soap, chocolate, cigarettes, or writing paper. Maria bought paper and wrote letters home. She was careful about what she said, knowing the letters would be read by censors. But she could tell her mother she was alive, she was safe, she was being treated well. When she wrote those words, "I am being treated well," she had to stop and stare at the paper. Was it true? Yes, undeniably true. The Americans were treating her better than her own military had in the final chaotic months of the war. The women talked endlessly in the evenings, processing their strange new reality. Some adapted quickly, grateful simply to be alive and fed. Others struggled with anger and shame. One night, sitting on her bunk with Lucia and 3 other women, Maria found herself part of a conversation that exposed the cracks in everything they had believed. "I do not understand," said Francesca, a former nurse from Rome. "We were told the Americans were devils, that they would torture us, abuse us. But where is this torture?" "It will come," said another woman, Bianca, bitterly. "They are being nice to make us weak. Then they will show their true nature." "But when?" Lucia asked. "Right. We have been here 2 weeks. When does the cruelty begin?" Silence fell over the group. Finally, Maria spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "What if it does not begin? What if this is their true nature?" The other women turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Francesca asked. "I mean, what if we were lied to?" Maria said, the words feeling dangerous even as she spoke them. "What if the Americans are not monsters? What if they are just people, like us, and we were told lies to make us hate them?" "But why would our government lie to us?" Bianca demanded. "Because governments always lie when they are losing," Lucia said softly. "My father told me that once. I did not believe him then." Maria thought about Thomas and Joe carrying her through the snow. She thought about Captain Morrison working to save her legs. She thought about the simple gifts, wool socks and chocolate, given freely to an enemy. "I collapsed on the road," she said. "I could not walk. The American medics did not have to help me. They could have left me there. No one would have known or cared, but they did not. They carried me for hours. They gave me their warmth. They saved my life. They need us healthy so we can work," Bianca said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Do they?" Maria challenged. "What work have we done that they could not do themselves or have their own soldiers do? We cook meals, wash clothes, tend a garden. These are not essential tasks. They do not need us for this." Francesca nodded slowly. "She is right. They do not need us. They are feeding us because they believe it is the right thing to do." "The Geneva Convention," Lucia added. One of the translators told me about it. It is rules about how to treat prisoners. The Americans follow these rules. But we did not follow such rules, another woman said quietly. In Africa. In Russia. The stories we heard about how our side treated prisoners. She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish. The conversation died into uncomfortable silence. They were approaching dangerous territory, questioning not just propaganda, but their own nation's conduct in the war. Over the following weeks, Maria found herself observing everything with new eyes. She watched how the American soldiers interacted with each other, casual, sometimes joking, but with an underlying respect. She noticed how even the lowest-ranking private could speak up if he disagreed with something and officers would listen. This was different from the rigid hierarchy she had known in the Italian military, where questioning an order could result in severe punishment. One day, while working in the kitchen, she saw two American soldiers arguing about something. Their voices were raised, and they gestured emphatically. Maria tensed, expecting violence. Instead, after a few minutes, one of the soldiers laughed, clapped the other on the shoulder, and they walked away together, still talking. Disagreement without violence, debate without punishment. It was a small thing, but it struck Maria deeply. Angelo, the translator, sometimes sat with the Italian prisoners during their free time, helping them practice English. He told them about America, about the different states, the various immigrant communities, the idea that people from all over the world could become American. My grandparents came from Sicily, he said one evening. They spoke no English, they were very poor, but they worked hard, and now look, I am here, in uniform, serving my country. This is the American way. But you are at war with Italy, one woman said. Does that not bother you? Angelo's expression grew serious. It bothers me very much. I have cousins still living in Palermo, but I am American now. America gave my family a chance when we had nothing. That means something. Maria thought about this concept, that nationality could be a choice, not just an accident of birth. That a person could belong to a place because of shared values, not just shared blood. It was a strange idea, but somehow appealing. She began to recognize individual American soldiers. There was Corporal Hayes, a farm boy from Iowa who loved to talk about his family's pigs. Private Washington, a black soldier from Georgia who faced prejudice from some of his fellow soldiers but never let it break his spirit. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the doctor, a quiet man from Massachusetts who read poetry in his free time. These were not monsters. These were just young men far from home, doing a job they had been sent to do. And if they were not monsters, what did that mean about everything else she had believed? The turning point came in early spring, almost 3 months after Maria's arrival at the camp. News filtered through that the war in Europe was ending. Germany was collapsing. Italy had already surrendered. The fighting would soon be over. With this news came uncertainty. What would happen to the prisoners? Would they be sent home? Would they be held indefinitely? Would there be trials? The camp commander, Colonel Patterson, called an assembly of all the Italian prisoners. Through Angelo and other translators, he addressed them directly. The war is ending, Angelo translated. You will be repatriated to Italy as soon as transportation can be arranged. You will be returned to your families. A murmur ran through the crowd, relief mixed with anxiety. I want you to know, Angelo continued translating, that you have behaved with dignity during your time here. You have worked hard and followed the rules. You have my respect for that. When you return home, Italy will need to rebuild. I hope you will help build a better future. That night, Maria could not sleep. Return home. The words should have filled her with joy, but instead she felt deeply conflicted. She thought about Naples, the rubble, the hunger, the devastation. She thought about her mother and sister struggling to survive. She wanted desperately to see them again. But she also thought about the months she had spent in American captivity, the food, the warmth, the medical care, the simple human kindness. She had been treated better as a prisoner of war than as a citizen of her own country in the final years of the war. This realization sat heavy in her chest. It was not just about the physical treatment, it was about dignity, about being seen as a human being worthy of care and respect. Lucia found her sitting outside the barracks, looking at the stars. You are troubled, Lucia said, sitting beside her. I am ashamed, Maria admitted. I should be happy to go home. But I am afraid. Here I am safe. Here I am fed. What waits for me in Italy? Hunger, ruins, more suffering? We will rebuild, Lucia said, but she did not sound convinced. Will we? Maria asked. How do you rebuild when everything is destroyed? How do you rebuild trust when you know your government lied to you, sent you to fight for a cause that was built on lies? Lucia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You are not the same Maria who collapsed on that road. No, Maria agreed. I am not. That Maria believed what she was told. She followed orders without question. She thought she understood the world. And now? Now I know I understand nothing. But I know this. Kindness matters. How we treat people matters. The Americans taught me that, even though they are supposed to be my enemy. A few days later, Thomas and Joe visited the camp. They were being rotated to a new assignment and wanted to say goodbye to some of their former patients. When Maria saw them, she walked over immediately, moving with strong, healthy legs that no longer hurt. Angelo was there to translate. "Your legs," Thomas said, smiling widely when he saw her walking normally. "They are completely better." "Yes," Maria said through Angelo. "Because of you. Because you carried me when I could not walk. Because you gave me your jacket when I was cold. Because you treated me like I mattered." Thomas looked embarrassed. "We just did our job." "No," Maria said firmly. "Your job was to care for American soldiers. I was the enemy. You did not have to help me. But you did. Why?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Joe, then spoke slowly so Angelo could translate carefully. "In medical training, they teach us a principle. First, do no harm. It does not say do no harm to Americans or do no harm to friends. It says do no harm. Period. You were hurt. We could help. That is all that mattered." Maria felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I will never forget this. When I return to Italy, when I tell my family about the war, I will tell them about you. About how the enemy showed me more humanity than I had seen in years." Joe spoke up and Angelo translated. "We are not enemies. Not really. Governments are enemies. People are just people." Those words stayed with Maria long after Thomas and Joe left. People are just people. It was such a simple idea, yet it demolished entire ideologies. That night she wrote in a small notebook she had bought with her camp wages. She wanted to remember everything. The cold road, the collapse, the feeling of being lifted onto a stretcher, the gentle hands of medics who saw her as a person, not an enemy. She wrote, "I learned that the line between enemy and friend is thinner than we are told. I learned that kindness can come from unexpected places. I learned that when we strip away the uniforms and the flags and the propaganda, we are all just people trying to survive, and some of us choose to survive with grace." The transportation arrangements took several weeks to finalize. During that time, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. The women were no longer prisoners waiting in uncertainty. They were travelers preparing for a journey home. The Americans provided them with new clothes to replace their worn uniforms. Each woman received a small package of supplies for the journey: food, water, basic hygiene items, and a blanket. Maria was struck once again by the unnecessary kindness of it all. They could have been sent home in the same clothes they had worn on arrival, but instead they were given fresh clothing, supplies, even a small amount of money. American dollars that could be exchanged once they reached Italy. On her last night at the camp, Maria walked the perimeter with Lucia, memorizing the place that had been her home for 4 months. "I never thought I would feel nostalgic about a prison camp," Lucia said with a sad laugh. "It was not really a prison," Maria said. "Not like we feared. It was more like a refuge." "A refuge run by our enemies," Lucia pointed out. "Are they still our enemies?" Maria asked. "The war is ending. Italy and America are not fighting anymore. Maybe we can stop being enemies now." Lucia squeezed her arm. "I hope so. I hope we can all stop being enemies." They traveled by truck to a port city, then boarded a ship bound for Naples. The ship was crowded with repatriated Italian prisoners, men and women, all heading home. The journey across the Mediterranean took 3 days. Maria stood at the rail, watching the water pass by, thinking about everything that had changed since she had last made this crossing months earlier. When the Italian coast came into view, many prisoners cheered. Maria felt a complicated mix of emotions: happiness to be returning home, but also apprehension about what she would find. The ship docked in Naples in early May 1945. As Maria walked down the gangway onto Italian soil, she looked around at the city she had left months before. It was worse than she had imagined. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Buildings stood like hollow shells. People moved through the streets with the slow, defeated movements of those who had endured too much. But there were also signs of hope. Reconstruction had begun in some areas. Markets were opening again, though the goods were sparse. Children played in the ruins, finding joy even in destruction. Maria made her way through the familiar streets toward her family's apartment, her heart pounding. Was the building still standing? Were her mother and sister still alive? The building was damaged but still standing. Maria climbed the stairs with trembling legs, legs that worked now, legs that had been saved by enemy medics. She knocked on the door of what had been her family's apartment. Her mother opened the door. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then her mother pulled her into a fierce embrace and both women wept. "Maria! Maria, you are alive! We heard nothing. We thought, oh, my daughter." Rosa appeared, taller than Maria remembered, thin but healthy. The 3 women held each other and cried tears of relief and joy. Later, sitting in their small kitchen, Maria told them about her experience. She told them about the march, the collapse, the American medics who had carried her through the snow. "They saved my life," she said simply. "The enemy saved my life when they did not have to." Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We were told many lies during the war. Perhaps this is the beginning of learning the truth." Over the following weeks and months, Maria helped her family rebuild their life in post-war Naples. She found work, contributed to the household, helped care for Rosa, but she never forgot the Americans who had shown her kindness. She kept the wool socks Thomas had given her, even when they wore thin and needed darning. They were a reminder of a simple truth, that even in the worst of times, even between enemies, humanity could prevail. Years later, Maria would tell this story to her children and grandchildren. She would tell them about the frozen road where she fell, unable to feel her legs. She would tell them about Thomas and Joe, the American medics who carried her to safety. She would tell them about Captain Morrison, who worked to save her feet. She would tell them about the simple gifts, wool socks and chocolate, that meant more than gold. But most importantly, she would tell them about the lesson she learned in that moment when she was most vulnerable and afraid. "The world tells us to hate our enemies," she would say. "Governments and leaders create divisions, draw lines, convince us that the people on the other side are monsters. But I learned something during the war. I learned that most people, when given the choice, will choose kindness over cruelty. Most people, when they see someone suffering, will try to help." She would show them the worn wool socks, carefully preserved in tissue paper. "These socks represent something important. They represent the moment I realized that the enemy was not who I had been told he was. The enemy was not the American medic who gave up his warmth for me. The enemy was not the doctor who saved my legs. The enemy was not the soldiers who treated me with dignity. The real enemy was the hatred itself. The real enemy was the lies we were told to make us hate each other." For Maria Russo, the moment her legs gave out on a frozen road in January 1944 became the moment her understanding of the world collapsed and was rebuilt. She had expected cruelty and received compassion. She had expected abandonment and received rescue. She had expected to be treated as less than human and instead was treated with a dignity that transformed her. The American medics had saved more than her legs that day. They had saved her faith in humanity, and that is the story worth remembering. If you found this account meaningful and want to hear more incredible true stories from World War II, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. These stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always individuals who choose compassion over hatred, who see people instead of enemies, and who prove that kindness can survive even the worst of wars. Thank you for watching, and remember, the lessons of history are not just about the conflicts we fight, but about the humanity we choose to preserve.